All right, strap in, everyone. Today we're going deep, a real deep dive into economic policies in developing countries. We've got a whole pile of research here. And the main one, well, it paints a pretty interesting picture, of this thing economists are calling, get this, when it rains, it pours.
Catchy,
Yeah.
right. But it highlights a real problem. It's this tendency for developing countries to kind of double down on certain policies when things are good and then, oh boy, scramble when the economy takes a hit.
So they're kind of stuck in this cycle, like feast or famine.
Yeah, you could say that.
So break it down for us. Like, what does this when it rains, it pours thing actually look like when it's happening?
Okay, so this research, they looked at over 100 developing countries.
Wow, 100.
Yeah, over decades, and a really clear pattern emerged. When their economies are booming, governments tend to spend more, borrow more, and even see a decrease in this thing called the inflation tax.
Inflation tax. That sounds scared.
Well, it's basically the hidden cost of inflation eating away at your purchasing power?
Okay, I see. But hold on, that doesn't sound very logical. Wouldn't you want to be more careful when times are good? Save for a rainy day?
You'd think so, right? But that's not what we see happening a lot of the time.
Really?
Yeah, the research suggests that during these good times, boom periods, everyone's feeling good, optimistic, investors are pouring in, tax revenues are up, and governments, well, they feel like they can spend more on things like big infrastructure projects or social programs.
So it's like a party. Everyone's just throwing money around thinking the good times will never end.
Yeah, kind of like that. But then something happens. Always does, right?
Oh,
A global recession hits, or maybe commodity prices crash, some kind of external shock. Suddenly the party's over. Investors, they pull out, revenues plummet, and these developing countries, they're left with a ton of debt and not a lot of resources to deal with it.
and that's when they try to hit the brakes, right? But isn't it too late by then?
That's the problem. It's not just too late, but often the things they do to try and fix it, well, they make things worse.
Yikes.
Like, they might raise interest rates to try and stabilize their currency or control inflation, or they might cut spending drastically.
But wouldn't that just, like, make the economy shrink even more? Sounds like a vicious cycle.
It is, it really is. And the research is pretty clear. This pro-cyclical pattern, this amplifying of the ups and downs, it leads to more volatility, deeper recessions, and sometimes even full-blown financial crisis.
Wow, that's pretty alarming. But this research, it wasn't just about describing the problem, right? They also tried to explain why this keeps happening.
They did, yeah. The authors, they don't have one definitive answer, but they suggest some interesting possibilities.
Hmm, what kind of possibilities?
Well, one of them is political pressure.
Ah, politics.
In a lot of these countries, governments feel pressure. They might feel like they have to spend during the good times to keep certain groups happy or, to stay in power.
So it's not always about smart economics. It's about short-term political gains.
Exactly. And another thing they highlight is the weakness of institutions in some developing countries.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you don't have strong checks and balances, or if there's a lack of transparency or even corruption, it becomes a lot easier for governments to spend unsustainably when the money's floating.
I see. So it's not just about the money itself. It's about the whole system around it.
Precisely. And another factor they mention is, well, think about it. When a developing country's economy takes a hit, it can be really tough for them to borrow money, especially on terms that are, favorable.
Right, they're seen as riskier.
Exactly, and that can force them into making even bigger cuts or accepting really tough conditions from lenders.
So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, huh? Tough choices, limited options.
It's a tough reality for a lot of these countries facing these cyclical challenges.
Okay, so this research lays out some pretty compelling arguments, but I'm guessing it's not the end of the story, right? I mean, there are other economists out there, other viewpoints.
Oh, absolutely, there are. And there have been some really interesting critiques and alternative perspectives offered in response to this research.
Let's dive into those then. I'm curious to hear what other folks have to say about this when it rains, it pours phenomenon. What are some of the counter arguments?
Well, there's one prominent economist, and they suggest we need to think differently about business cycles when it comes to developing countries. You see, they argue that while developed economies tend to have these relatively stable trends, with some ups and downs, emerging markets, they're different.
Different how?
Well, their whole growth trajectory can be way more volatile. Think of it like a roller coaster, sudden drops and climbs, not just gentle hills. This economist, they argue that this volatile trend, it overshadows those temporary shocks that typically drive business cycles in developed economies.
Okay, so it's not just about ups and downs. It's about a much more dynamic landscape. But how does that tie into this when it rains, it pours idea?
Well, imagine this. A developing country, they enter a high-growth phase. Maybe they discover a valuable resource or implement some really successful economic reforms. Investors, naturally, they flock in to take advantage. And this influx of capital, it can create this sense of euphoria, lead to increased government spending as policymakers bet on this positive trend continuing.
So it's not necessarily recklessness. It's more like riding a wave. They think it's a long-term upswing.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. And this economist even suggests that some of those policies that seem pro-cyclical, they could actually be linked to these regime changes, these shifts in the economic landscape. They give the example of Argentina adopting a currency board in the early 90s, which, by the way, stopped hyperinflation and attracted a lot of capital. It was a big shift, a major one, and it had a huge impact on the government's economic decisions.
That's really interesting. So maybe it's not always about governments making bad choices, but about them responding to these, well, these much bigger, more volatile changes in their economies.
Exactly. And this perspective, it challenges the idea that pro-cyclical policies are always bad. It's saying we need to consider the broader context, the circumstances surrounding those policy decisions.
This is fascinating stuff. So are there any other alternative viewpoints we should be considering?
There is another economist who offers a slightly different take. They argue that this pro-cyclical behavior we see, it might be more a result of the types of shocks these countries face rather than just their policy responses.
So they're saying developing countries are basically getting hit with different, more volatile punches, economically speaking.
Basically, yeah. They even go as far as to suggest that if developed countries were hit with the same kinds of shocks, they might react in a similar way. Procyclically, I mean.
Now, that's a bold statement. How did they reach that conclusion?
They focused on physical policy, especially government spending. They compared basically the relationship between a country's economic output and its government spending across a bunch of countries, both developed and developing.
So, like, how much government spending changes when the economy is doing well or poorly?
Yeah, exactly. And what they found was pretty interesting. While it's true that developing countries tend to show a more pro-cyclical pattern, meaning their spending goes up more during booms and down more during busts, they also noticed that not all developed countries were the opposite, counter-cyclical.
So it's not as simple as saying all developed countries are responsible and all developing countries are prone to these wild swings.
Right, it's more nuanced than that. This economist argued that it's more like a spectrum, and they suggested that maybe those differences in how countries manage their spending, well, it could be because of the types of economic shocks they experience.
Okay, so a country that relies heavily on oil exports, they'd react differently to a global oil price drop than, say, a country with a more diverse economy, right?
Exactly, and they didn't stop there. They also wanted to look at this tricky issue of endogeneity, the fact that government spending can both react to and influence economic output.
It's like that chicken and egg problem. How can you tell if a change in spending is a response to a shock or if it's causing the shock itself?
Right, it's tricky. So they argued that just looking at the correlation between spending and output isn't enough. You need a way to isolate the government's response from the shock itself.
Okay, how do you do that? How do you separate those two things?
Well, they propose using something called an instrumental variable. It's basically a factor that influences economic output but isn't directly affected by government spending decisions.
I'm following you. What did they use?
They looked at terms of trade. It's the ratio of export prices to import prices. The idea is that, say, if a country's export prices are rising, that could boost output without directly impacting government spending decisions.
I see. So by using terms of trade, they could get a clearer picture of how government spending responds to these external shocks.
That was the idea. And what they found, using this terms of trade instrument, was that the separation we saw earlier between developed and developing countries in terms of how pro-cyclical their spending is, it started to get blurry.
So the gas narrowed when they factored in these external shocks.
Yeah, which suggests that maybe those differences we see in spending patterns are partly due to the different types of economic punches each group is facing.
Okay, but hold on. Using terms of trade like that, isn't that kind of controversial? I mean, couldn't changes in export prices also influence government spending sometimes?
You're right to be skeptical, and this economist, they acknowledge that there are valid concerns about whether terms of trade are truly independent of government spending, especially in countries that really depend on exporting commodities.
Because, like, a commodity price boom could lead to higher output and more government revenue, which could then change spending decisions, right?
Exactly. So while this analysis was suggestive, it wasn't, a slam dunk, it didn't prove definitively that the types of shocks countries face are the only explanation for this when it rains, it pours phenomenon.
Okay, so it added another piece to the puzzle but didn't totally overturn the original research. Anything else?
Well, recognizing those limitations, they actually took it a step further. They used a statistical technique to examine that relationship between government spending and output, while, get this, accounting for multiple underlying economic shocks.
Wow, so they were trying to like untangle all these different factors that could be influencing spending decisions?
Yeah, exactly. And what they found was that the relative importance of those different shocks might be a key factor in explaining why we see these correlations between spending and output.
So it's not just about whether shocks happen, but about how big they are and how they interact with each other.
Precisely. Think of it like a recipe. Different combinations of ingredients will give you different results, even if you're using the same basic cooking method.
I like that analogy. So are they saying developing countries are inherently more vulnerable to certain types of shocks, or are they just experiencing a more volatile mix of them?
Their analysis pointed to the latter. It seems like the shocks that tend to push both spending and output in the same direction, either up or down, are just more dominant in the developing world.
So these shocks that create this feedback loop, amplifying both booms and busts, they're more powerful in developing countries.
That's what it looks like. And to back that up, they compared how government spending behaved over time within developed countries. And guess what? They found a similar pattern. Periods where spending and output were closely linked, well, those were the periods when those positive commencement shocks were more common.
Interesting. So it seems like we're getting a more nuanced understanding of this when it rains, it pours idea. It's not just about governments messing up. It's also about them dealing with these powerful external forces.
That's a great way to put it. And while this research doesn't give us, a simple solution, it does show how important it is to understand the specific challenges each country faces and, tailor policies to fit those challenges,
So a one-size-fits-all approach to economic policy just won't cut it.
especially not in the developing world. And it also highlights the importance of building resilience to these shocks, whether it's through diversifying their economies, strengthening institutions, or improving access to financing when times are tough.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. We looked at the original research about this when it rains, it pours thing, and we've explored some alternative viewpoints that offer a more nuanced understanding.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that even with these different perspectives, everyone agrees that this pro-cyclical pattern can have serious consequences for developing countries.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? What are the key takeaways for our listeners?
I think one of the biggest takeaways here is that these pro-cyclical policies, this tendency to kind of, amplify the natural economic ups and downs, it makes developing countries much more vulnerable
Vulnerable to what?
to those big swings, deeper recessions. It's like, imagine building a house on a shaky foundation,
Oh, yeah. Not good when the earthquake hits.
Exactly. And the research even suggests these amplified cycles can increase the risk of financial crises, which, as we all know, can have ripple effects across the globe.
So even if we're, sitting here not living in a developing country, this is still something we should care about.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these crises can disrupt trade, investment flows, even migration patterns. It's a good reminder that we're all connected in this global economy.
True, true. Okay, so we've established that this is a serious problem, but what can be done about it? Are developing countries just stuck in this boom and bust cycle forever?
I wouldn't say doomed. The research, it doesn't offer any magical solutions.
No silver bullet, huh?
Right, but it does highlight some potential strategies for, breaking free from this pattern.
Okay, so what can they do?
Well, first off, strengthening institutions and promoting good governance is crucial. When you have governments that are transparent, accountable, and operating within a strong framework, checks and balances, they're less likely to make those impulsive spending decisions during the good times.
So it's about creating a system that encourages long-term thinking, even when everyone's feeling pressure to spend, spend, spend.
Yeah, exactly. And another big thing is addressing those underlying vulnerabilities, the things that make developing countries more susceptible to these volatile economic shocks in the first place. That might mean diversifying their economies, reducing their reliance on commodity exports, or, finding ways to improve their access to financing during those tough times.
So it's kind of a two-pronged approach, right? Build resilience to those shocks and create a system that promotes responsible policymaking.
Yeah, you got it. It's a tall order, for sure, but it's definitely worth the effort.
What makes it worth it?
Think about the potential benefits: greater stability, stronger economic growth, and ultimately a better quality of life for people in these countries.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I started this whole thing thinking that this when it rains, it pours phenomenon was just about governments making bad choices.
I can see why you'd think that.
But now I see it's so much more complex than that. There's this whole web of factors at play.
And I think that's a key takeaway for everyone listening. It's important to go beyond those simple narratives. We need to understand the specific challenges each country is facing, the types of shocks they're dealing with, and the whole context in which these decisions are being made.
It's a reminder that economics, it's never just about the numbers, right? It's about people, it's about politics, it's about these global forces, and let's be honest, sometimes it's just about plain old luck.
I like that. And ultimately, it underscores the importance of smart policymaking, both within countries and internationally, to help developing countries navigate these challenges and achieve more sustainable, more equitable growth.
This when it rains, it pours thing, it's something I'm definitely going to be thinking about more. It's a powerful reminder that we're all in this together, and the choices we make, individually and collectively, had a real impact.
That's a great point to end on. It's a complex issue, but I think by understanding it better, by having these conversations, we can work towards finding solutions.
Well said. That wraps up our deep dive for today, but I have a feeling this conversation is far from over. We've got to keep asking those tough questions and, challenging conventional wisdom. So until next time, keep those brains buzzing and happy learning, everyone.